Welcome back to Lost in Translation. Just to remember what we're doing here, we understand that the Bible was written in cultures and times and languages very different from ours. So it's no surprise that sometimes we can feel a little lost when we're reading it. So in this video series, we're learning some tools and strategies for navigating the most challenging parts of the Bible together. So today, we're exploring the parts of Exodus that have raised the most questions. Two key ideas are really going to help us find our bearings in this book: covenant and image. Once we understand these key concepts, so much of Exodus and really the whole Old Testament begins to make more sense. So let's start with covenants. In the ancient Near East, a covenant was a formal partnership. Treaties were a common type of covenant. Those covenants established a partnership between a powerful ruler called a suzerain and a weaker nation called a vassal. These covenants often followed a rescue. The suzerain might defeat the vassal's enemy or provide food during a famine, and in return, the vassal would pledge loyalty, obedience, and pay tribute. The suzerain, in turn, promised protection and provision, but if the vassal broke the covenant, the consequences could be severe, sometimes even deadly. So the majority of scholars think this is the kind of covenant that God is making with Israel in the book of Exodus. God is the suzerain, rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt, and establishes a covenant partnership with them. He promises to bless them, to live among them, to make them his representatives to the world. And Israel, as the vassal, agrees to follow God's instructions, to remain loyal to him and reflect his character to others. And this brings us to God's name, which keeps showing up in Exodus. In the ancient world, a name often reflected someone's character. So in Exodus 3, God reveals his name to Moses: I am who I am. And this tells us something profound about God. God is alive, present, uncreated, eternal. A name then conveys character. But name is also a synonym for reputation. In Exodus 9:16, God tells Pharaoh that he'll be used to make God's name known throughout the earth. So in this context, God's name refers to God's reputation, his reputation for power, justice, and mercy. Reputation and character mattered deeply in the honor-shame cultures of the ancient Near East. In Exodus, God entrusts his name, his reputation, to Israel. That's a huge responsibility. Israel is called to live in a way that displays God's character and spreads God's good reputation. When they're warned not to take God's name in vain, it literally means don't carry God's name lightly. Representing God is a serious task, and God, the suzerain, takes it seriously too. So this covenant partnership between Israel and God it's like God's partnership with Adam and Eve. Just as they were created to be God's image bearers, his representatives in the world, God now calls Israel to fill that same role. Now, of course, like Adam and Eve, Israel will fail to live up to their end of this covenant partnership, but God's response to their failure will even reveal something about God's character. Okay, now let's explore some of the most challenging passages in Exodus together and see how these ideas of covenant and name can help us when we feel lost. Now, the story about God hardening Pharaoh's heart has raised a lot of important questions. Does God make people sin? How can God hold someone accountable if they're not truly free to make their own choices? Now, a lot changes from the beginning of Pharaoh's story to the end of it, and noticing those changes can really help us make sense of what's happening here. Now, early in the story, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and the Hebrew word used here is hazak, which means strong or resolute. In Egyptian culture, this kind of hardness was seen as a virtue in a leader. A good ruler was expected to be hazak, strong-willed, confident, firm in their decisions, even under pressure. It's a morally neutral word. Someone can be resolute in doing good or evil. But Pharaoh, we see, is resolute in rebelling against God, refusing to release the Israelites. Even as God sends the first few plagues his way, Pharaoh digs in his heels and refuses to change course. Now, at this point in the story, something very important changes. God now begins to harden Pharaoh's heart. And a new Hebrew word for harden is introduced here. It's the word kaved, which means heavy. In Egyptian religion, a person's heart was weighed against a feather in the afterlife. A light heart was innocent, while a heavy heart was guilty. So what does it mean for God to make Pharaoh's heart heavy? A minority of scholars think that it means God caused Pharaoh to sin. But most scholars interpret this very differently. They suggest that making Pharaoh's heart heavy either means that God declared Pharaoh guilty or allowed Pharaoh to follow through on his bad decisions and to experience the full weighty consequences of his rebellion. But wait, there's one more word for harden that gets used in this story: kasa. Kasa means stiff or stubborn. It only appears once in this entire story. It's in Exodus 7, verse 3, where God says he will kasa Pharaoh's heart. Some scholars connect this word to an earlier use of it in Exodus 4. Now, in that passage, Moses picks up a snake by the tail, and it stiffens, kasa, becoming a staff. And the stiffened snake becomes a useful tool for demonstrating God's power and authority. And this might suggest that when God says he will kasa Pharaoh's heart, he is announcing his intention to use Pharaoh's stubbornness as a tool for demonstrating his own power and authority. And that's exactly what happens. In Exodus 9, verse 16, God tells Pharaoh, "I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." The mighty, stubborn Pharaoh is like a snake, taken by the tail and used by God to make his name known to the nations. Now let's look at one of the more bizarre passages in all of the Bible, and this time we'll lean on what we know about covenants to make sense of it. The story is found in Exodus 4, verses 24 to 26. It looks like God is about to kill Moses here, and his wife Zipporah steps in, circumcises their son, and touches Moses with the child's foreskin, which somehow saves Moses' life. So what on earth is going on here? Now, to understand this, we need to go back to the origins of circumcision. In Genesis 15, God promises Abraham and Sarah that he will give them a massive family, one that will become a nation through which the whole world will be blessed. But in Genesis 16, when Sarah still hasn't become pregnant, she forces her Egyptian servant Hagar to have a child with Abraham. So instead of trusting God, they take matters into their own hands and abuse the vulnerable and less powerful. Then in Genesis 17, God reaffirms his promise to Abraham and Sarah and establishes a covenant partnership with them. Circumcision becomes the sign of this covenant, marking Abraham's body as a reminder of his agreement with God. It's also a kind of confession and repentance, cutting off the old way of living and committing to living God's way instead. And from that time on, circumcision is a physical, visible sign of belonging to God's covenant family of Israel. Genesis 17:14 is clear. Anyone who refuses to circumcise will be cut off from God's people. It's non-negotiable for those who want to be part of this partnership. Now we fast forward to Exodus 4. Moses hasn't circumcised his own son, and this is a huge problem. How can he lead Israel to be a faithful covenant partner with God when he's broken the covenant like this? So his wife, Zipporah, is a Midianite. She's not even an Israelite. And she understands the gravity of the situation. She circumcises their son and touches the foreskin to Moses and saves his life. Keeping a covenant with a suzerain is a matter of life and death. But there's even more going on here. Exodus uses a literary device called prefigurative typology. Moses is a type of Israel. His personal experiences in Exodus 1 through 6 foreshadow what the whole nation of Israel will go through later on. So, for example, Moses is saved as a baby when Pharaoh tries to kill all the Hebrew boys, just as Israel will be rescued from Pharaoh. Moses is drawn out of the waters of the Nile, and later Israel will be drawn out through the waters of the Red Sea. Moses meets God on a mountain at the burning bush and hides his face in fear, foreshadowing Israel later meeting God at a mountain and being too afraid to go up and meet with him. God provides a well for Moses when he's on the run in the wilderness, just as God will later provide for Israel in the wilderness. This circumcision story in Exodus 4 fits into this pattern, and seeing what it foreshadows helps us make sense of it. Zipporah's act of circumcision prefigures the Passover. And if we know what the Passover is about, we can work backward to better understand what Exodus 4 is about. So at Passover, God warns that he will strike down the firstborn in every household. No one is exempt. But anyone who signals their trust and allegiance to God by touching the blood of a lamb to their doorframe will be spared. In both stories, death is the consequence of disobedience to God, and blood is the visible sign of obedience and trust that turns away death and preserves life. So speaking of the Passover, let's talk about what, for me, is the most difficult part of Exodus: God killing the firstborn. Look, I'm reluctant to even tackle this question because I realize any answer we come up with won't make this story any less troubling. Life is sacred, and the loss of life is tragic, always. I think God sees it that way too. And if God values life so much, then why would God take the lives of the firstborn? We find this story in Exodus 12. But way back in Exodus 4, God refers to Israel as his firstborn son. And this is significant. In our culture, in a healthy family, every kid is equally important and treasured. But in the ancient Near East, the firstborn son was uniquely important. He inherited not only the family's wealth, but also its responsibilities and commitments and authority. The firstborn was the continuation of the family's legacy, its future and reputation. He represented the family in the broader community and often took over as the family leader once the father was no longer able to fulfill that role. So losing a firstborn son wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a devastating blow to the entire family's very survival and their standing in society. And Pharaoh enslaved God's firstborn son. And even worse, issued a decree to murder every Hebrew baby boy by throwing them into the Nile. Now, in the legal codes of the ancient Near East, like Hammurabi's code, justice demanded that the punishment mirror the crime, an eye for an eye. In Exodus 4, verses 22 to 23, we read the message from God that Moses delivered to Pharaoh. Israel is my firstborn son, God says. And I told you, Pharaoh, let my son go so he may serve me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. According to ancient laws, this was justice. But God isn't only just. God is also merciful. Pharaoh's slaves had no way out, and the Hebrew babies thrown into the Nile, they had no escape. Yet God provided a way for anyone, Israelite or Egyptian, to be spared. God instructed each household to sacrifice a lamb and place its blood on the door frames of their home. He promised, When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you. This was an invitation for anyone, regardless of nationality or status, to trust God and be saved. Even Pharaoh. God's judgment always comes with an opportunity to turn back, trust him, and receive mercy and life. This event shapes God's name or reputation. Word spreads beyond the people of Israel that God is just and merciful, the God of all people who brings life to anyone who trusts him. So some Egyptians came to believe this and trust this God. Exodus 12:38 tells us that when the Israelites were finally set free from Egypt, a mixed multitude also left Egypt with them. God's name spread among the nations. So today, we got a clearer picture of what an ancient covenant was and why God's name or reputation matters so much. And we've seen how these two ideas are key to understanding so much of the book of Exodus. Plus, we learned a big new word, prefigurative typology, how events in one story often foreshadow what's coming later on. Now, recognizing these patterns can help us find the main idea and the deeper significance of confusing passages in Exodus and the rest of the Bible too. So in our next episode, we'll learn about the law and ask if Christians have to obey it. We'll discover something fascinating in all those boring construction plans for the tabernacle, and we'll find out if God punishes kids for the stuff their parents do. All of that is coming in our next video. See you then.